In the late 1950s, at the height of Cold War paranoia, the United States Army Corps of Engineers embarked on one of the most ambitious, most secretive, and ultimately most dangerous military engineering projects in human history. A project so impossible, so risky, and so deeply classified that even the government of the country on whose soil it was built had no idea what was happening beneath its frozen land. A project that intended to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles under a living, moving glacier. Project Iceworm, a plan to build a vast underground nuclear missile complex beneath the Greenland ice sheet, disguised behind the innocent name Camp Century, the city under the ice. Camp Century was publicly described as a scientific base, a symbol of American ingenuity operating in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, powered by a portable nuclear reactor, staffed by scientists and engineers studying snow physics, Arctic living conditions, and glacier behavior. But behind this facade lay a massive strategic deception. The real goal, conceived in the Pentagon's deepest war rooms, was to carve out 2,500 miles of tunnels beneath the ice, a frozen labyrinth in which the United States could secretly deploy 600 Iceman nuclear missiles aimed squarely at the Soviet Union, hidden so deep and so widely across Greenland's interior that no Soviet strike could eliminate them. The ice was supposed to be the perfect cover, self-sealing, impenetrable, camouflaging the entire project from satellites, spies, or air reconnaissance. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack, the missiles would survive. If the US needed to fire, the missiles, mobile, underground, constantly shifting in position, would be nearly impossible to target or disable. At least, that was the theory. The reality was far more terrifying. The story began in 1958, when the Army Corps of Engineers proposed the idea of an underground missile grid beneath Greenland, arguing that the ice sheet offered both concealment and stability. The Pentagon needed new missile deployment sites because Soviet advancements in ICBMs were rapidly shrinking America's reaction time. The existing land-based missile fields in the United States were too predictable. Submarines offered mobility, but were still technologically unreliable. But Greenland, remote, massive, and sitting atop the Arctic approach route to the USSR, seemed perfect. Denmark, which owned Greenland, had signed a 1951 defense agreement allowing American military presence, but the US never told Denmark what it truly intended to do. Instead, the US told Copenhagen that Camp Century was simply a scientific research outpost. When construction began in 1959, engineers were stunned by the complexity of carving a city under a glacier. The ice sheet was not a stable platform. It was flowing, compressing, bending, and deforming at rates scientists barely understood. The Army Corps built 21 huge snow tunnels, each large, enough for vehicles, connected by 3,000 feet of side passages, and covered them with steel arches that were then buried under snow. Inside these tunnels, they constructed dormitories, laboratories, workshops, kitchens, communication centers, and the camp's most controversial feature, a portable nuclear reactor shipped in from the US and assembled on site to power the entire base. The idea was to simulate the conditions necessary for a much larger system, Iceworm. As winter set in and the first crew settled into Camp Century, the US military collected enormous amounts of data on snow behavior, temperature cycling, ice compression, and glacier movement. But the data revealed a problem that threatened the entire Iceworm concept. The ice was alive. The tunnels began to deform within months. Steel arches bent under the slow, relentless force of glacial pressure. Walls that had been perfectly straight began to bow inward. The floors shifted, ceilings sagged. The Army Corps attempted reinforcements, cutting new trenches, lowering roofs, jacking up supports. But it was like trying to hold back an ocean with wooden boards. The glacier swallowed everything. Even the nuclear reactor, designed to be the camp's technological triumph, became a headache. Engineers struggled to keep the reactor stable in sub-zero temperatures. Ice creep threatened the reactor chamber, and the reactor's waste heat created melting that risked destabilizing the tunnels. Still, the U.S. kept the Iceworm plan alive. On paper, the missile grid was a masterpiece. 600 launching sites connected by tracks beneath the ice. Missile transport vehicles would roam the tunnels, constantly shifting the missiles' positions so the Soviets could never determine their location. The complex would cover an area the size of Alabama, an entire secret state beneath the glacier. But as engineers continued collecting data, the truth became undeniable. The ice sheet was far too unstable to house a permanent missile system. Tunnels collapsed faster than they could be repaired. Within a single year, Camp Century needed major reconstruction just to remain habitable. The glacier's natural movement, several feet per year, made long-term missile accuracy impossible. The carefully aligned tunnels buckled, twisted, and shifted out of configuration. Yet the public never knew. Camp Century was still being advertised as a triumphant Arctic research station. Magazine articles referred to it as the City of Tomorrow. Newsreels showed smiling soldiers skiing and working in gleaming underground corridors. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, engineers wrote increasingly desperate reports warning that the base was collapsing. Still, the Pentagon pushed forward. The Army conducted weapons tests, tunnel expansions, and nuclear reactor stress evaluations. But by 1962, the structural deformation had become so severe that entire sections of Camp Century had to be abandoned. Engineers predicted total collapse within 3 to 5 years. And then everything changed. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. Suddenly, the US and USSR were closer to nuclear war than ever before. The military reevaluated all strategic missile programs. Iceworm, already unstable, problematic, and diplomatically dangerous, was deemed too risky. The Pentagon quietly shelved the project. Camp Century limped on as a research station until 1966, when creeping ice distortion forced the military to abandon it entirely. The nuclear reactor was removed, but most of the camp, including tunnels, vehicles, fuel, toxic materials, and radioactive coolant, was left buried beneath the ice, sealed away with the assumption that the glacier would remain frozen forever. The project was classified for decades. Neither Denmark nor the world learned the truth until the 1990s, when declassified documents revealed the full scale of the plan. The Danish government was shocked and furious. The idea that the US had planned to hide 600 nuclear missiles under Danish territory without permission became a political scandal. But even more alarming was a modern revelation. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. Climate data suggests that by the end of this century, Camp Century, and all the toxic materials buried with it may re-emerge. Iceworm, the secret nuclear missile city that never came to be, might return as an environmental catastrophe. But in the early 1960s, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the United States had attempted to build a secret missile grid under a living glacier, nearly triggering a diplomatic crisis with an allied nation and proving that in the Cold War, even the ice was a battlefield. And the true story of Project Iceworm was only beginning to unfold. As Project Iceworm advanced into the early 1960s, the U.S. military, still driven by the fear of a Soviet first strike and desperate for any strategic advantage, doubled down on studying the Greenland ice sheet, despite mounting evidence that the glacier was not a stable foundation, but a living, breathing, shifting mass of ice whose movement made the entire missile concept increasingly unrealistic. Yet secrecy, budget pressures, and Cold War paranoia kept the project alive long past the point when logic should have killed it. Meanwhile, inside Camp Century, the men stationed under the ice wrestled daily with the harsh truth that the tunnels meant to last decades were already collapsing around them, that their roofs sagged visibly month after month, that steel beams groaned under the impossible pressure of millions of tons of compacted snow, that floors bulged and cracked as the glacier shifted beneath their feet, and that even the nuclear reactor, the camp's beating heart, was only barely manageable deep beneath the Arctic ice, requiring constant monitoring to prevent overheating, ice melt, or structural compromise in a place where evacuation could take hours. Engineers wrote reports warning that Iceworm was fundamentally flawed. The ice didn't just move vertically under pressure, it flowed horizontally, like an incredibly slow river, deforming everything it touched, twisting tunnels into crooked shapes, compressing steel like clay and threatening to crush any missile shaft before it could be installed. These warnings were quietly filed away because the Army needed Iceworm to succeed, needed a future weapon system that could survive a Soviet first strike, needed something to justify continued funding in the shadow of rapidly advancing Air Force missile programs that were already competing for dominance inside the Pentagon. The Army was fighting for relevance in a world shifting toward ICBMs, and Iceworm was its golden ticket, a chance to carve a strategic niche underground beneath the ice, invisible to satellites and bombers. That ambition drove them to conduct experiment after experiment, carving experimental trenches, testing structural reinforcements, and measuring ice creep rates with obsessive precision, all while pretending publicly that the camp was a simple scientific research station, a harmless Cold War curiosity where soldiers studied snow crystals and Arctic survival, never revealing that the ice cores they extracted were actually being analyzed for structural stress properties in preparation for a 2,500-mile underground missile grid. But beneath the heroic propaganda films and cheerful press photos, the reality was stark. Camp Century was dying. Tunnels distorted faster each year. Doors stuck. Ceilings dropped inches at a time. Snow piled up in unexpected places. The ice cracked like gunshots in the night. And beneath it all, men slept in bunks while the glacier shifted above their heads. Yet even as the camp deteriorated, the Army continued developing the technical backbone of Iceworm, a mobile missile launcher designed to operate underground, a missile designated LIM-49 Nike Zeus, and later Iceman, capable of being transported through underground tunnels and launched through shafts drilled into the ice. Engineers imagined the missiles being constantly repositioned by tracked vehicles running silently through the frozen labyrinth, their locations changing daily so Soviet intelligence could never map them, creating a shell game of nuclear firepower beneath thousands of feet of ice. They believed this mobility would guarantee survivability against any Soviet attack. But while the Army dreamed of mobility, reality delivered chaos. The tunnels at Camp Century were already narrowing as the ice compressed them, and even small transport vehicles scraped against the walls. Each year, the camp had to be redug, re-leveled, re-supported, costing vast resources and manpower, simply to maintain a base that was meant to be a prototype for something far larger. The missile grid, if ever built, would require continuous excavation forever, an impossibility in both cost and logistics, yet Pentagon planners continued to push forward. Meanwhile, the political dimension grew even more precarious. Denmark, officially a nuclear-free nation at the time, had absolutely no idea that the United States had installed a nuclear reactor under its territory, much less that the U.S. planned to bury hundreds of nuclear missiles there. The 1951 U.S.-Denmark Defense Agreement allowed for American bases, but did not mention nuclear weapons or underground missile fields. Denmark believed Camp Century was nothing more than an Arctic research station, a symbol of scientific cooperation during the Cold War. But inside American war rooms, strategists referred to Iceworm as the future of U.S. nuclear deterrence. If Denmark learned the truth, the entire project would collapse diplomatically. So the U.S. buried the truth under deeper layers of secrecy, classifying documents, restricting personnel, and ensuring that even most American troops stationed at Camp Century had no idea they were living inside a prototype for a nuclear city. But secrecy bred negligence. When structural collapse accelerated in 1962, the Army reported the issue internally, yet made no attempt to inform Denmark that the massive engineering works under their ice sheet were becoming unstable. Instead, they reinforced the tunnels again, cutting deeper trenches, lowering ceilings to relieve stress, and jacking up beams that bent back into deformation months later. These repairs were not upgrades. They were life support for a system that nature was actively killing. Still, the Army clung to its vision. They believed the missile grid could be built deeper under the ice, away from the rapidly deforming surface layers, using advanced tunneling techniques that had never been tested. They believed larger steel trusses could slow ice creep. They believed that with enough funding, technology could defeat geology. But even as they tried to salvage the project, the geopolitical landscape shifted. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the terrifying speed at which nuclear conflict could escalate. In response, the U.S. accelerated its development of hardened ICBM silos in the American Midwest and expanded its fleet of nuclear submarines. These new systems, stable, reliable, maintenance-free, made Iceworm look outdated, expensive, and unnecessary. The Joint Chiefs began questioning whether it was worth hiding missiles under thousands of feet of unstable ice when solid ground solutions already existed. Funding slowed, support weakened, and Iceworm began its quiet death. But Camp Century's problems were far from over. By 1963, scientists at the camp noticed something unexpected. The glacier above them was melting slightly during summer months, causing meltwater to trickle down through fissures and refreeze in unpredictable patterns, accelerating structural collapse. Global warming was not yet a political issue, but the implications were clear. A base dependent on stable ice was being undermined by seasonal instability. The Army ignored the warning. They continued operations another year, but now the deformation was so severe that interior walls bowed inward, lights hung crooked from sagging ceilings, and heavy equipment had to be relocated continuously. Even the nuclear reactor, once a symbol of Cold War prowess, became a liability as its containment structures shifted. In 1964, engineers submitted a final, damning assessment. Maintaining Camp Century required more effort than constructing it in the first place, and full-scale Iceworm would be logistically impossible without constant reconstruction due to ice creep that could not be halted or controlled. The Pentagon buried the report in classified archives. Only a handful of officials ever saw it. But the decision was made. Project Iceworm would never be built. Camp Century was kept alive a little longer for public-facing research. But behind the scenes, the Army began withdrawing personnel and shutting down sections of the camp. By 1965, the nuclear reactor was dismantled and removed, a dangerous and complex operation carried out quietly in the Arctic winter. In 1966, Camp Century was finally abandoned, its tunnels left to collapse under the crushing weight of the glacier. Engineers assumed the ice sheet would entomb the remains forever, preserving the camp as a frozen time capsule. But they left behind everything that wasn't nuclear: diesel fuel, chemical waste, sewage, radioactive coolant traces, building materials, and machinery, buried under snow that would, they believed, never melt. Iceworm remained classified until 1995, when documents leaked showing that the U.S. had planned to hide nuclear missiles under Danish territory without permission. Denmark was outraged. The discovery triggered political uproar and forced the Pentagon to acknowledge the truth. But the most alarming revelation came not from politics, but from climate scientists. In the 21st century, as Greenland's ice sheet began melting at unprecedented rates, researchers warned that the abandoned tunnels, waste, and nuclear residues of Camp Century would eventually resurface. The base meant to be sealed forever might thaw within decades. Today, Camp Century sleeps under tens of meters of shifting snow, its tunnels crushed flat, its buildings collapsed, its reactor gone, but its waste still buried. Project Iceworm, once a grand Cold War dream, is now a ticking environmental time bomb, and a stark reminder that even the most secretive military plans cannot outlast the unforgiving forces of nature. As the United States quietly abandoned Camp Century in 1966, sealing off the entrance and allowing the glacier to swallow the last traces of the city under the ice, Project Iceworm entered a second, more shadowy life. One defined not by construction, but by concealment, classification, political maneuvering, and the delicate balancing act of preserving Cold War secrecy while preventing diplomatic fallout with Denmark, a critical NATO ally who still had no idea that the U.S. had attempted to build a nuclear missile grid beneath their Arctic territory. Thus began a 30-year battle to bury Iceworm not just physically under the ice, but politically, diplomatically, and historically, under layers of classified documents, misleading statements, and selective disclosures, because what had happened in Greenland was far more than an engineering experiment. It was a geopolitical gamble that violated international agreements, risked nuclear contamination, and exposed the dangerous lengths to which the U.S. military was willing to go to maintain strategic supremacy. After Camp Century's closure, American military officials wrote a series of internal memoranda insisting that all potentially sensitive material, including the true purpose of Iceworm, be locked away under the highest classification, with only a handful of individuals granted access. They believed the public explanation, that Camp Century was purely scientific, would hold indefinitely, because no one in Denmark had reason to question it, and the U.S. could always rely on Cold War secrecy to protect the truth. But secrecy was fragile. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, hints began to surface. Danish journalists uncovered inconsistencies in U.S. military statements about the camp. A scientist who had visited Camp Century in its final years noted the presence of oddly oversized tunnels, far too large for typical research needs. A Danish parliamentary review discovered references to nuclear materials present at the site despite Denmark's strict anti-nuclear laws. These fragments were concerning, but none were enough to expose Iceworm. Still, the Pentagon watched nervously. If Denmark discovered that the U.S. had violated its nuclear policy, and done so covertly, it could fracture NATO unity at a time when the Soviet Union was pushing aggressively for influence in Scandinavia. Meanwhile, the abandoned camp continued its silent descent deeper into the glacier. Snow accumulated, tunnels flattened, entire sections collapsed under the relentless force of ice creep. Machinery left behind, trucks, generators, fuel drums, and laboratory instruments became entombed within compacting layers of ice. Chemical waste seeped into pockets that froze instantly, locking toxic materials in place. Diesel fuel that had been stored in tanks remained trapped underground, its containers slowly deforming under the pressure. Even small amounts of radioactive coolant residue from the nuclear reactor lingered within the ruins, embedded in the frozen environment that the U.S. believed would remain sealed forever. But the glacier was not eternal. By the 1990s, global climate research revealed disturbing changes in Greenland's ice sheet. Temperatures were rising, meltwater was increasing, crevasses were shifting in ways scientists had never seen. Suddenly, the assumption that Camp Century would remain buried forever was no longer certain. And then came the event that exposed everything. A Danish journalist submitted a request for access to U.S. military archives concerning Greenland. Expecting routine documents, Danish officials instead received a partially declassified file titled Project Iceworm, containing clear evidence that the U.S. had planned to build an underground nuclear missile network beneath Greenland without Denmark's knowledge or approval. The revelation exploded across Danish media. Headlines portrayed Iceworm as a betrayal, an illegal militarization, and an affront to Denmark's sovereignty. Politicians demanded answers. Public outrage mounted. Denmark felt deceived. And for the first time, ordinary citizens learned that their country had been used as a potential launch platform for hundreds of U.S. nuclear missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. The scandal triggered emergency meetings within NATO. The United States scrambled to perform damage control. American diplomats argued that Iceworm had never been fully implemented and that Denmark had therefore suffered no actual violation of sovereignty. But Danish officials countered. The U.S. had intended to violate their nuclear-free policy. The fact that the project failed did not absolve the deception. The controversy strained U.S.-Danish relations for years. Secret memoranda later revealed that American officials feared the scandal would disrupt NATO's northern defense strategy, potentially pushing Denmark toward a more neutral stance. But the scandal's impact did not stop at politics. As climate change accelerated in the 21st century, scientists began warning that the abandoned waste at Camp Century, including dramatic quantities of diesel fuel, sewage, toxic chemicals, and radioactive residues, would eventually resurface as the ice sheet continued to melt. A study published in the mid-2010s concluded that by the end of the century, meltwater could reach the buried ruins, carrying contaminants downstream into the Arctic ecosystem. What had been a Cold War strategic outpost was now a potential environmental disaster, created by a project that had never been officially acknowledged until decades later. Meanwhile, historians revisiting declassified documents uncovered even deeper layers of Iceworm's ambitions. The missile network was meant to be dynamic, constantly shifting locations, making it invulnerable to Soviet targeting. The underground grid would have required constant excavation teams, nuclear-powered shelters, and incredibly complex logistics, all hidden beneath an ice sheet thousands of feet thick. It was one of the most ambitious military engineering plans ever conceived, rivaling nuclear submarines and the distant early warning line in scale. But unlike those projects, Iceworm relied on a false assumption that the ice was stable. From the very beginning, Army engineers had measured ice movement and structural deformation that proved the concept was flawed. Yet the pressure to create a new strategic asset kept the project alive. Iceworm became not just an example of Cold War ambition, but of Cold War denial, a refusal to accept physical reality, because doing so would undermine a military dream. And that dream was enormous. Iceworm's tunnels, if fully built, would have stretched across an area larger than many U.S. states. Missile launch shafts would have been drilled deep into the ice, designed to open at the surface using explosive caps. Mobile missile carts would have carried Iceman missiles through the frozen labyrinth. Nuclear reactors would have powered the underground city. Thousands of troops and technicians would have lived beneath the ice year-round. This was not a small plan. This was a hidden nation beneath the glacier, but the glacier rejected it. Every tunnel, every chamber, every steel arch succumbed to the unstoppable physics of moving ice. Camp Century served as a warning that engineering dreams cannot defeat nature. And yet, even as Iceworm collapsed physically and politically, parts of the idea resurfaced decades later in modern strategic thinking. The concept of survivable, concealed missile networks persists in military theory. But none have attempted anything as extreme as burying a nuclear arsenal under a living ice sheet. Today, researchers visit Camp Century only through radar imaging and remote sensing. The camp lies crushed, flattened, mangled beneath tens of meters of compacted snow. No human can enter. It is too deep, too unstable, too dangerous. But satellites track the shifting ice above it. Climate models predict when meltwater will reach the buried waste. Every new study reveals how quickly Greenland is warming and how much closer the Cold War's buried environmental hazards are to resurfacing. In a strange twist of history, Project Iceworm, a plan once intended to safeguard the United States from nuclear war, now threatens global ecosystems not through weapons, but through pollution sealed beneath melting ice. And the political fallout continues. Denmark still debates the ethical implications of being kept in the dark. Greenland, which seeks increasing independence, views Iceworm as part of a long history of external powers exploiting its land. The United States, while acknowledging the project's existence, rarely comments on the environmental legacy. And the Soviet Union, the adversary for whom Iceworm was built, is gone. What remains is the reminder that during the Cold War, nations often pursued goals so secret, so ambitious, and so reckless that the consequences would be felt long after the geopolitical struggle ended. Project Iceworm, once a classified military fantasy hidden beneath a scientific facade, is now recognized as a symbol of Cold War overreach, an audacious attempt to reshape the natural world for the sake of nuclear strategy, and a stark warning of what happens when military ambition outruns environmental and political reality. But the story is not yet finished. As the ice continues to melt, and the camp edges closer to exposure, the world may soon confront a final chapter of Project Iceworm, one written not by generals or engineers, but by climate itself. By the late 2010s, as the Arctic warmed faster than any region on Earth, the long-forgotten remains of Camp Century began drawing global scientific and political scrutiny, transforming Project Iceworm from a Cold War secret into a modern symbol of geopolitical negligence and environmental danger. Because although the United States had abandoned the underground base more than half a century earlier, the glacier that once entombed it, a glacier the Army believed would remain frozen for thousands of years, was now retreating, thinning, and deforming at unprecedented rates, exposing the terrifying possibility that the toxic and radioactive waste buried under the ice might reemerge within decades, not millennia. triggering a crisis that Cold War planners never imagined. Climate scientists studying Greenland's surface melt patterns discovered that the region covering Camp Century had already warmed by more than 3 degrees Celsius since the camp's closure. And radar imaging revealed that meltwater channels were advancing downward through the ice sheet, potentially reaching the crushed tunnels where diesel fuel, solvents, chemical waste, radioactive coolant traces, and tens of thousands of gallons of contaminated materials remained frozen in place. And suddenly, Iceworm was no longer just an abandoned experiment. It was a ticking time bomb. Environmental researchers concluded that as meltwater penetrates deeper layers, it could mobilize pollutants, allowing them to spread through subglacial runoff into Arctic ecosystems, contaminating waters that support Inuit communities, fisheries, and fragile wildlife habitats. The realization horrified Greenlandic politicians, who accused both Denmark and the United States of failing to protect their land, while Denmark, caught between historical responsibility and modern political pressure, demanded full transparency from the U.S. about the waste left behind. In a dramatic twist, the U.S. government responded with caution, acknowledging the existence of the waste, but avoiding commitments regarding cleanup responsibility, arguing that under 1960s environmental norms, no one anticipated climate change of this magnitude, and therefore the liability remained unclear. But Greenlandic leaders countered sharply. The waste was American, the base was American, and the secrecy surrounding Iceworm had prevented Greenland from making informed decisions about its environment or its future. The issue escalated into international debate, with environmental organizations warning that Camp Century represented one of the world's first known cases where geopolitical secrecy had created an environmental threat that a warming climate would soon uncover. Meanwhile, Cold War historians revisited the declassified Iceworm archives, piecing together a story that was even more extraordinary than previously understood. They discovered that Iceworm was not merely a speculative concept. It was a fully developed operational plan featuring engineering blueprints, missile deployment maps, underground train systems, geothermal siphoning concepts, multi-reactor energy infrastructure, and strategic models predicting Soviet retaliatory patterns. In other words, Iceworm was not a distant fantasy. It was a blueprint for a hidden nuclear state beneath the ice. The scale of the design stunned scholars. The planned tunnel network would have required annual excavation of millions of tons of snow. Missile launch positions would have been rotated constantly to prevent Soviet targeting. Thousands of soldiers would have lived beneath the ice full-time, working in shifts to maintain the reactor grid, missile transporters, ventilation systems, and monitoring stations. Some designs even included underground hospitals, chapels, radio stations, and hydroponic farms. It was nothing short of a frozen Manhattan project, conceived, engineered, and partially tested without the knowledge of the host nation. But while scholars marveled at the audacity, engineers focused on the failure. Iceworm collapsed because it was built on a false assumption that the ice sheet was static. Yet modern science has confirmed the opposite. Glaciers flow, deform, melt, refreeze, and crack in dynamic ways that make long-term infrastructure impossible. Project Iceworm did not fail due to politics. It failed due to physics. The glacier simply rejected it. And yet, even as the world learned these truths, the ghost of Iceworm continued to influence modern strategy. Defense analysts began comparing Iceworm to contemporary concepts such as underground missile tunnels in China, mobile ICBM trucks in Russia, and rail-based nuclear platforms in North America. Iceworm was an early precursor to the idea of survivable, concealed nuclear assets, but one that crossed ethical and environmental boundaries in pursuit of military advantage. Today, Project Iceworm has become a case study taught in military academies, environmental science programs, and international relations courses, not for its engineering success, but for its failure in diplomacy, planning, and environmental foresight. It demonstrates how even the most powerful nations can lose control of their creations, how classified decisions can echo across generations, and how nature always has the final say. As Greenland continues to melt, the future of Camp Century remains uncertain. Scientists monitor the area with drones, radar, and thermal imaging, tracking changes in the ice sheet's depth and flow. The camp remains buried for now, but each year the ice above it thins a little more. One day, perhaps within decades, the entrance tunnel may reappear, its mangled arches emerging from the ice like the ribs of a fossilized beast, revealing a Cold War relic the United States hoped would remain hidden forever. And when it does, the world will confront the final chapter of Project Iceworm. Who cleans up the waste? Who pays for the environmental damage? And how should nations address the environmental legacies of their secret military experiments? The story of Project Iceworm began as a tale of Cold War ambition, of a government willing to carve a secret world beneath the ice to gain the upper hand in a nuclear standoff. But it ends as a cautionary tale about climate, responsibility, and the unintended consequences of secrecy. Beneath the Greenland ice sheet lies a crushed, frozen labyrinth once meant to house 600 nuclear missiles. Today, it stands as a monument not to American engineering, but to the limits of human control over nature, a buried reminder that no secret, no matter how deep, stays frozen forever.